There are moments in war when silence becomes heavier than gunfire. In the autumn of 1944, somewhere along the fractured roads of eastern France, a German reconnaissance unit experienced one of those moments. They had just captured an American M8 Greyhound armored car, intact, fueled, and operational. What should have been a routine seizure of enemy equipment became something else entirely. A technical revelation that would haunt the crew, their commanding officer, and eventually the engineers who read their report decades later. The M8 Greyhound was not supposed to be faster than anything the Wehrmacht had in its reconnaissance divisions. German doctrine relied on speed, mobility, and the superiority of their own Puma and Luch scout vehicles. But when Oberfeldwebel Ernst Kohler turned the ignition of the captured Greyhound and felt the engine respond with a smoothness his own vehicles had never offered, he knew something was fundamentally wrong with what they had been told. The crew had been operating along a contested supply route near the Vosges Mountains, tasked with intercepting American forward elements and capturing intelligence, their own SDK FZ. 234. Puma had been immobilized 3 days earlier, not by enemy fire, but by a fractured axle caused by months of overuse and insufficient replacement parts. The unit had been reduced to foot patrols and requisitioned civilian trucks. Morale was low. Fuel was scarce. The war was no longer about advancement, it was about survival. When the M8 was found abandoned in a ditch, its American crew likely having fled during a panicked retreat, Kohler's squad approached it with caution. They expected booby traps. They found none. They expected mechanical failure. The engine started on the second attempt. They expected it to be sluggish, heavy, inferior. It was none of those things. Kohler had been a mechanic before the war. He understood engines the way some men understood maps or weapons. As he guided the Greyhound onto the road and accelerated, he felt something he had not felt in years: efficiency. The vehicle moved with a kind of effortless grace that German reconnaissance cars, weighed down by armor and complexity, had long since lost. The transmission shifted smoothly. The suspension absorbed the uneven terrain without protest. The speed, God, the speed, was undeniable. His radioman, a young Gefreiter named Ulrich Baum, sat in the turret and stared at the speedometer in disbelief. "Kohler," he said quietly, "this thing is faster than the Puma." Kohler did not respond immediately. He knew what that statement meant. It meant their doctrine was flawed. It meant their engineers had prioritized the wrong variables. It meant that somewhere in the chain of decisions that led to the design of German reconnaissance vehicles, someone had miscalculated, or worse, had lied. The crew drove the Greyhound for 3 hours that day, moving it through secondary roads and forest trails to avoid detection by American patrols. They tested its acceleration, its turning radius, its fuel consumption. Every test confirmed what they already suspected. The M8 was not just competitive with German scouts. It was superior in nearly every practical measure that mattered in the chaos of reconnaissance warfare. That night, Kohler sat in a ruined farmhouse and wrote a report by candlelight. He was not a man prone to embellishment or drama. He wrote in the cold, factual language of a technician. He listed specifications. He compared performance metrics. He noted fuel efficiency, mechanical reliability, and ease of operation. And then, in the final paragraph, he wrote something that would later be underlined in red by an intelligence officer in Berlin. "If the enemy possesses reconnaissance vehicles of this quality in large numbers, our current tactical assumptions regarding mobility superiority are no longer valid." The report was submitted through the proper channels. It was filed, stamped, and forwarded to the appropriate Technical Evaluation Bureau. It disappeared into the vast administrative machinery of a collapsing military structure. Kohler never received a response. 2 weeks later, the M8 was destroyed during an Allied air raid. The crew survived. Kohler was reassigned to a static defensive position near the Rhine. He never saw another Greyhound. But he never forgot the sound of that engine, the sound of something working the way it was supposed to, without compromise, without the weight of over-engineering and ideological arrogance. The war ended. Files were scattered. Reports were lost. But in 1982, a German military historian, researching the technical failures of late-war reconnaissance doctrine, found Kohler's report in a declassified archive in Freiburg. It was a single page, typed on brittle paper, stamped with the seal of a unit that no longer existed. The historian included it in a footnote of a larger study. Few people read it, but those who did understood what it represented. A moment when a soldier looked at the machinery of war and realized that the lies extended even to the steel. Doctrine is the invisible structure that holds an army together. It is the collective belief in how war should be fought, how vehicles should be built, how men should move across a battlefield. But doctrine is also rigid. It does not adapt quickly. And when reality contradicts it, the men caught in that contradiction suffer silently. Ernst Kohler's report was not the first time German reconnaissance crews had voiced concerns about vehicle performance. Throughout 1943 and 1944, field reports from the Eastern and Western fronts consistently noted mechanical failures, fuel inefficiency, and excessive weight in scout vehicles. But these reports were often dismissed as the complaints of exhausted soldiers or blamed on poor maintenance under combat conditions. The truth was more uncomfortable. German reconnaissance vehicles had been designed under assumptions that were no longer valid. The early war successes of the Wehrmacht had been built on speed, surprise, and the ability to outmaneuver slower opponents. But by 1944, the strategic situation had reversed. German units were retreating, supply lines were collapsing, the industrial base was crumbling under sustained Allied bombing. The vehicles that had once been symbols of blitzkrieg dominance were now over-engineered relics, struggling to perform basic reconnaissance tasks. The M8 Greyhound, by contrast, had been designed with a different philosophy. American engineers prioritized simplicity, mass production, and ease of repair. The Greyhound was not the fastest vehicle on paper. It was not the most heavily armed, but it was reliable. It could be maintained by a crew with basic tools. It could operate for extended periods without specialized parts. And critically, it was light enough to achieve genuine speed without sacrificing stability. When Kohler and his crew tested the captured Greyhound, they were not just comparing two vehicles. They were comparing two industrial philosophies, two approaches to warfare, two definitions of what superiority meant. Kohler understood this instinctively. He had worked in a machine shop in Stuttgart before the war, assembling components for commercial trucks. He knew the difference between engineering for elegance and engineering for function. The Puma, for all its technical sophistication, required constant attention. Its complex suspension system was prone to failure. Its engine demanded high-quality fuel that was increasingly unavailable. Its turret mechanism, while impressive, added weight and mechanical vulnerability. The Greyhound had none of these problems. Its six-wheel drive system was straightforward. Its engine was a modified truck power plant, nothing revolutionary, but dependable. Its armor was thin, but it was never meant to fight tanks. It was meant to move, observe, and survive. And it did those things extraordinarily well. Ulrich Baum, the radio man, was less analytical than Kohler, but more willing to speak the quiet part aloud. "We've been told for years that American equipment is inferior," he said one evening as they sat in the farmhouse. "Propaganda, maybe, but we believed it. And now?" Kohler did not answer. He did not need to. They both knew what now meant. It meant that the ideological certainty that had sustained them through years of war was cracking. It meant that the enemy they had been taught to despise had, in at least this one critical area, outthought them. The rest of the crew felt it too. There was a strange, unspoken shame in driving the Greyhound, not because it was captured, but because it was better. Every smooth gear shift, every kilometer covered without mechanical complaint, was a small indictment of the system they had fought for. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are hearing this story. We are interested in knowing how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. There was a man in Germany who had predicted this moment. His name was Dieter Volkmann, and in 1942 he had been a junior engineer at the Büssing-Nag factory in Brunswick, one of the primary manufacturers of German armored reconnaissance vehicles. Volkmann had raised concerns about the weight-to-power ratios of the vehicles being produced. He had written memos, he had presented calculations, he had been ignored. Volkmann's argument was simple: adding armor and weaponry to reconnaissance vehicles was a category error. The purpose of reconnaissance was not to fight, it was to see and report. Every kilogram of additional weight reduced speed, increased fuel consumption, and made the vehicle less effective at its primary mission. But his superiors, influenced by both military doctrine and political pressure, insisted on vehicles that could engage enemy forces if necessary. The result was a fleet of reconnaissance vehicles that were too heavy to outrun threats, too lightly armored to survive serious engagements, and too complex to maintain in field conditions. Volkmann watched this unfold with the quiet despair of a man who knows he is correct but powerless. In early 1943, Volkmann was transferred to a technical evaluation unit tasked with analyzing captured Allied equipment. It was meant to be a punishment, a demotion disguised as reassignment. But for Volkmann, it became an education. He studied captured American vehicles, jeeps, half-tracks, and eventually an M8 Greyhound that had been shipped to a testing facility in Bavaria. He spent 2 weeks with that Greyhound. He dismantled the engine. He measured tolerances. He tested the suspension under simulated field conditions. And with each test, his earlier concerns were validated. The Americans had built a vehicle that did exactly what it needed to do, and nothing more. There was no excess, no ideological burden, just functional engineering. Volkmann wrote a detailed technical report. He did not frame it as a critique of German design philosophy. That would have been professional suicide. Instead, he presented it as an objective analysis of enemy capabilities. He noted the Greyhound's advantages: simplicity, reliability, ease of production. He recommended that future German designs adopt similar principles. The report was filed. It was read by mid-level administrators. It was summarized in a memo that reached someone in the procurement office. And then it was set aside. By mid-1943, Germany was no longer in a position to redesign its reconnaissance fleet. The industrial capacity did not exist. The war was accelerating beyond the point where such reforms were feasible. Volkmann continued his work, but the fire had gone out of him. He tested more vehicles. He wrote more reports. None of it mattered. The machinery of war had its own momentum, and individual engineers, no matter how correct, could not alter its trajectory. 3 days after capturing the M8 Greyhound, Ernst Kohler's reconnaissance unit was ordered to abandon the vehicle and rejoin their parent division near Strasbourg. The order came through fragmented radio communication, delivered by an exhausted staff officer who had no interest in discussing captured equipment. The strategic situation was deteriorating. American forces were advancing faster than German units could reposition. The Greyhound, despite its superior performance, was not worth the risk of being caught behind enemy lines while operating a vehicle that would draw immediate fire from both sides. Kohler understood the logic. He also understood what it meant. They were giving up the one piece of equipment that actually worked. His own unit's Puma remained immobilized, stripped for parts to keep other vehicles operational. They would return to the war on foot or in requisitioned trucks that barely functioned, while the Greyhound, fast, reliable, efficient, would be destroyed to prevent recapture. Before they left, Kohler did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He took a wrench from the Greyhound's toolkit and slipped it into his pack. It was a small thing, stamped with American markings, worn smooth by use. He told himself it was a souvenir, but it was more than that. It was evidence, proof that what he had experienced was real. The crew scattered the Greyhound with gasoline and set it ablaze. They watched it burn in silence, the flames casting long shadows across the forest clearing. Ulrich Baum, the radio man, turned away before the fuel tank exploded. He could not bear to watch something so functional be consumed by waste. They marched west through mud and rain, rejoining a division that no longer resembled the disciplined force they had once been part of. Men moved like ghosts. Officers issued orders without conviction. The machinery of war was collapsing, but it continued grinding forward through sheer inertia. Kohler rarely spoke during those final months. He performed his duties mechanically, maintained what equipment remained, and waited for the inevitable. But at night, in the cold dugouts and ruined buildings where they sheltered, he would sometimes take out the American wrench and turn it over in his hands. It was heavier than German tools, built to different tolerances, stamped with a serial number that meant nothing to him. But it represented something he could not articulate, a different approach to the same problem, a choice that had been made differently. Baum noticed. One night, as they sat in the basement of a shelled schoolhouse near Karlsruhe, he asked quietly, "Do you think they knew?" Kohler did not need to ask what he meant. The engineers? Yes, some of them knew. Then why? Because knowing is not enough. Kohler set the wrench down on the stone floor between them. Knowing requires someone to listen, and no one was listening. The war ended 3 months later. Kohler survived. Baum survived. Most of their unit did not. They were processed through prisoner-of-war camps, released, and returned to a country that no longer existed in any recognizable form. The Germany they had fought for was gone, replaced by occupation zones and collective guilt. Kohler returned to Stuttgart and found work in a factory rebuilding commercial vehicles. He never spoke about the war. He never mentioned the Greyhound. But he kept the wrench. It sat in a drawer in his workshop for 40 years, a small piece of forged steel that carried the weight of a larger truth. In 1985, a journalist researching veteran experiences contacted Kohler for an interview. The journalist was young, too young to remember the war, interested in personal stories rather than grand narratives. Kohler agreed reluctantly. During the interview, the journalist asked about equipment, about the vehicles Kohler had maintained and operated. Kohler hesitated. Then he retrieved the wrench from his workshop drawer and placed it on the table between them. "This is from an American armored car," he said quietly. "We captured it in 1944. It was faster than anything we had. More reliable, simpler, everything our vehicles should have been but were not." The journalist asked why that mattered. Kohler looked at the wrench for a long moment before answering. "Because it meant someone had made better choices, and we had not. And all the men who died in vehicles that failed, they died because of those choices." The interview was published in a regional newspaper. Few people read it. But a copy found its way to Dieter Volkmann, the engineer who had tried to warn his superiors decades earlier. Volkmann wrote to Kohler. They met once, in a cafe in Munich, two old men who had seen the same failure from different angles. They did not talk long. There was not much to say. They had both known the truth. They had both been powerless to change it. The war had been a machine that consumed everything, including the voices of men who understood what was wrong. Volkmann died in 1989. Kohler died in 1993. The wrench was donated to a small military museum in Stuttgart by Kohler's daughter, who did not fully understand its significance but knew her father had wanted it preserved. It sits now in a display case, labeled simply, "American Tool, circa 1944. Visitors pass it without pausing. It is one object among thousands, a fragment of a war that has been studied, documented, and archived into numbness. But for those who know the story, For the few historians who have read Kohler's interview, Folkman's reports, and the scattered field documentation of that autumn in 1944, the wrench represents something more. It represents the moment when soldiers and engineers confronted the same truth and could do nothing but witness it. The document surfaced in 1998, more than 50 years after the events they described. A German researcher named Dr. Margarete Seidel was conducting a comprehensive study of Wehrmacht technical reports for a project on late-war logistics failures. She was working through boxes of unsorted files in the military archive in Freiburg when she found Ernst Kohler's original report, filed alongside dozens of similar documents that had never been properly analyzed. Seidel had seen hundreds of field reports during her research. Most followed predictable patterns: complaints about fuel shortages, requests for replacement parts, descriptions of equipment failures. But Kohler's report was different. It was precise, technical, and uncomfortably honest. It did not blame circumstances or enemy action. It stated plainly that captured American equipment outperformed German equivalents. She cross-referenced the report with other documents from the same period and found a pattern. Multiple reconnaissance units had filed similar observations. Engineers at testing facilities had reached identical conclusions. The evidence was consistent, detailed, and ignored. Seidel expanded her research. She located Dieter Volkmann's technical analyses from 1943. She found procurement memos that acknowledged the weight and complexity problems in German reconnaissance vehicles, but deferred solutions indefinitely. She discovered correspondence between factory managers and military procurement offices, discussing the political impossibility of admitting that American design philosophy might be superior in certain applications. What emerged was not a story of incompetence, but of systemic paralysis. The German military-industrial complex had become trapped by its own doctrines, unable to adapt even when confronted with clear evidence of failure. Ideology, bureaucracy, and the desperate momentum of a losing war had created an environment where truth could not function. Seidel published her findings in a specialized academic journal in 2001. The article was titled "Reconnaissance Vehicle Performance and Doctrinal Rigidity, a Case Study in Late-War Wehrmacht Technical Evaluation." It was thorough, meticulously sourced, and read by approximately 200 people, most of them academics specializing in military history. One of those readers was James Harding, an American historian researching the development of the M8 Greyhound. Harding had spent years documenting the vehicle's design process, its deployment, and its performance record. He knew the Greyhound had been effective, but he had not fully understood why until he read Seidel's article. The German perspective provided the missing context. The Greyhound had not succeeded because it was technologically advanced. It had succeeded because it was appropriately designed. American engineers had understood the actual requirements of reconnaissance warfare and built a vehicle to meet those requirements without excess. German engineers, constrained by doctrine and ideology, had built vehicles that tried to do too much and succeeded at too little. If this story has surprised you, go ahead and leave a like to help the channel. Harding contacted Seidel. They corresponded for several months, sharing documents and perspectives. Harding was struck by the tragedy embedded in the German reports. "These were smart people," he wrote to Seidel. "They saw the problem clearly, and they were powerless." Seidel's response was measured. "That is often how systems fail, not through ignorance, but through the inability to act on knowledge." Together, they co-authored a paper comparing American and German approaches to reconnaissance vehicle design. It was published in 2004 and received moderate attention within military history circles, but the broader public remained unaware. The story of the captured Greyhound, the engineer who warned his superiors, and the crew who could not forget what they had experienced remained obscure, buried in footnotes and specialized publications. There are sounds that linger longer than memory. For Ernst Kohler, it was the sound of the M8 Greyhound's engine, smooth, consistent, efficient. It was a sound that represented something his own vehicles had never achieved: reliability without compromise. In the decades after the war, as Kohler rebuilt his life in Stuttgart, that sound would occasionally surface in his mind. He would be working on a commercial truck engine, adjusting a carburetor or replacing a worn bearing, and suddenly he would hear it again. The clean rhythm of an engine that had been designed correctly from the beginning. He never romanticized the memory. He did not think of the Greyhound as a superior machine in some abstract sense. He thought of it as evidence of a better process. Engineers who had been allowed to solve problems without ideological interference, who had prioritized function over doctrine, who had built something that worked because working was the only requirement. Ulrich Baum, the radio man, carried a different memory. For him, it was not the sound, but the feeling of acceleration, the smooth, uninterrupted increase in speed as the Greyhound responded to Kohler's commands. His own unit's vehicles had always struggled, laboring under their own weight, engines straining, transmissions grinding. The Greyhound had moved as if it wanted to move, as if resistance had been engineered out of it. Baum had become a school teacher after the war. He taught mathematics and physics in a small town near Heidelberg. Sometimes, when explaining concepts like efficiency or mechanical advantage, he would think of the Greyhound. He never mentioned it to his students. How could he explain that a captured American armored car had taught him more about engineering principles than any textbook? But the memory influenced how he taught. He emphasized simplicity. He warned against overcomplication. He told his students that elegance in problem-solving was not about adding complexity. It was about removing everything unnecessary. One of his students, years later, became an automotive engineer. She remembered Baum's emphasis on simplicity and applied it throughout her career. She never knew why her teacher had been so insistent on that principle. The connection between a Wehrmacht radioman's experience in 1944 and her work designing fuel-efficient vehicles in the 1980s remained invisible, but it was there. Dieter Volkmann, the engineer, carried the heaviest burden. He had known before the capture of any Greyhound that German reconnaissance vehicles were flawed. He had tried to prevent the problem and failed. After the war, he continued working in automotive engineering, but he never fully recovered from the experience of being correct and ignored. In his final years, Volkmann mentored younger engineers. He was known for being demanding, skeptical of fashionable trends, and insistent on rigorous testing. His colleagues found him difficult. They did not understand that his severity came from trauma, the trauma of watching preventable failures unfold, of knowing that warnings mean nothing if the system cannot hear them. He died in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall fell. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his contributions to post-war automotive development. It did not mention his wartime work. It did not mention the reports he had written, the warnings he had issued, or the American vehicles he had studied with such care. But his influence persisted in the engineers he trained, in the standards he insisted upon, in the culture of rigorous testing he helped establish in the German automotive industry's post-war reconstruction. The Greyhound's lesson that simplicity and reliability matter more than impressive specifications had been absorbed, transmitted, and embedded in a new generation's approach to design. The M8 Greyhound that Ernst Kohler's crew captured was destroyed in October 1944. Its steel melted and scattered, consumed by fire and forgotten by history. But the information it carried, the lesson embedded in its design, survived in fragments, in reports, in memories, in the choices of engineers who never knew they were inheriting knowledge from a burning forest clearing in eastern France. This is how truth moves through war, not through grand revelations or official acknowledgements, but through small transmissions. A wrench kept in a drawer, a report filed and forgotten, a teacher's emphasis on simplicity, an engineer's insistence on testing. The system that failed to listen in 1944 eventually absorbed the lesson, but only after the men who tried to deliver it were gone. The tragedy is not that German reconnaissance vehicles were inferior. The tragedy is that the people who understood why they were inferior were rendered powerless by a system that valued doctrine over evidence, ideology over function, the appearance of strength over actual capability. Dr. Margaret Seidel's research, published decades after the war, documented this failure with academic precision. But even her work, thorough and rigorous, reached only a small audience. The story remained obscure, a footnote in the vast literature of World War II, overshadowed by battles and generals and the grand narratives that dominate popular understanding of the conflict. And yet, the story matters. It matters because it reveals how systems fail, not through dramatic collapse, but through the accumulation of ignored warnings, the suppression of inconvenient truths, the prioritization of institutional momentum over adaptation. It matters because the pattern repeats in militaries, in corporations, in governments, in any organization large enough to become deaf to its own members. The M8 Greyhound was not a perfect vehicle. It had limitations. It was vulnerable to heavy weapons. Its armor could not withstand serious anti-tank fire, but it was appropriate. It did what reconnaissance vehicles were supposed to do: move quickly, observe effectively, and survive long enough to report. German reconnaissance vehicles, designed with different priorities, failed at these basic tasks. They were too heavy to outrun threats. They were too complex to maintain in field conditions. They consumed resources that could not be replaced, and the men who operated them knew it. Ernst Kohler knew it when he drove that captured Greyhound through the autumn forests of France. Dieter Volkmann knew it when he dismantled another Greyhound in a Bavarian testing facility. The pattern was clear. The evidence was overwhelming, and none of it mattered, because the system could not change. In 2018, a small military museum in Stuttgart held an exhibition on World War II reconnaissance vehicles. Among the displays was the wrench that Kohler had kept for 40 years. The curator, who had read Seidel's research, included a placard explaining its significance. The placard was brief, factual, and ultimately insufficient to convey the weight of what the object represented. Visitors passed the display without pausing. A wrench is not dramatic. It does not command attention the way tanks and aircraft do. But for those few people who stopped and read the placard, who understood the context, the wrench became something more, a physical fragment of a moment when soldiers confronted the limits of their own system and could do nothing but witness the failure. The war ended. The Greyhounds were decommissioned, sold to other nations, eventually scrapped. The German reconnaissance vehicles that survived were melted down or placed in museums. The documents were filed, archived, and slowly digitized. The men who lived through these events died, their memories preserved imperfectly in occasional interviews and scattered correspondence. But the lesson remains, encoded in steel and paper and the persistent memory of those who inherit these stories, that speed is not about horsepower alone, that complexity is not strength, that the ability to listen matters more than the ability to command, and that sometimes the greatest failures are not the ones that explode dramatically, but the ones that grind forward quietly, consuming lives through preventable mistakes that everyone could see, but no one could stop. The M8 Greyhound was faster than German scouts, not because American engineers were more skilled, but because they were allowed to design a vehicle that worked. That permission, the freedom to prioritize function over ideology, was the real advantage. And it was an advantage that could not be captured, only learned. The war ended, but the steel still carries the lesson. For those willing to listen, It speaks with the voice of engineers who tried to warn, soldiers who tried to adapt, and systems that failed not through ignorance, but through the willful deafness that comes from confusing doctrine with truth. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of the German crew that captured an M8 Greyhound and learned what their own doctrine could not teach them. We'll see you in the next video.